and welcome to another episode of It's a History podcast. I am your host, Madison, and this week we are starting a multi-part series on the history of food safety and regulations surrounding food. If you live in the US, you may be aware of the spike we have been having in regard to food recalls due to rollbacks on funding for food safety. That had me thinking about the history of food safety and how we got to where we are today. Like most, I have learned about Upton Sinclair and the jungle, which was a criticism of Chicago-based meatpacking plants, and the abysmal lack of food safety. We will be addressing this area of food safety and regulation in a future episode. This week, we are going to look at food safety prior to germ theory being discovered and recognized, and also looking into regulations that took place when it came to milk. We have always had to eat food and drink water, so when did we start to regulate our food and drink? Well, looking back at our history, we have made many discoveries along the way that would prevent foodborne illness. One of the first being to simply cook the food over flame. Going back nearly 2 million years with the discovery of fire, also came the discovery of cooking. Though we now know that cooking meat killed bacteria, parasites, and fungi, it can be assumed that our prehistoric friends made the association that cooked food led to less death, and less death was the preferred way to live. For much of human history, there was no in-home refrigeration or freezing, so food was often found, prepared, and eaten essentially all at the same time. During the winter months in the colder climates, early humans would utilize the naturally occurring ice to preserve food for a longer period of time, especially when the source of food would be more sparse. For those who did not have access to sub-zero temperatures, there were other methods of keeping food for longer periods of time. This includes drying and salting to remove moisture from the food and starving the bacteria of water. Pickling was also something our historic friends would turn to, as this would make an acidic environment that would be too hospitable for any bacteria to grow. Alcohol would dissolve bacteria into tiny little bits, and very high concentrations of sugar would suck out all the water from the bacteria, leaving the bacteria to die and the food safe for human consumption. Now, for most of human history, these were the methods that would have made our food, while not 100% safe, the safest it could be for human consumption. It would not be until we discovered microbes and microorganisms, and finally accepting germ theory, that we would start to have any actual understanding as to how bacteria actually worked. For most of human history, it was widely believed that diseases were caused from noxious forms of bad air and smells. This theory was called miasma, and was what dominated the healthcare practices. This meant that doctors and surgeons wouldn't wash their hands, wear masks, or operate in clean clothes. Miasma would be the dominant thinking up until the time in which germ theory came about. When did we accept germ theory, you may be asking? Well, it wouldn't be until the mid to late 19th century, when there were multiple people who were all kind of thinking in the same plane that there may be something more to disease than bad air or smells. Even after germ theory was proven, it took quite some time for this to be accepted. Let's take a few minutes to look at Louis Pasteur, Joseph Lister, Robert Koch, and Carl Flug. Louis Pasteur, who lived from 1822 to 1895, was a French chemist and microbiologist that discovered that microbes were the ones responsible for souring alcohol. He also came up with the process of pasteurization. He and his team were responsible for creating vaccines for anthrax and rabies. Louis Pasteur was not the first person to propose that diseases were caused by microorganisms, but his experiments were an integral part of the process in proving that microorganisms exist. In 1865, Pasteur turned his attention to solving the silkworm crisis in France. After 5 years of research, Pasteur succeeded in proving that the transference of disease that was affecting the silkworm population in France was in fact from silkworm to silkworm, by working to isolate the microorganisms that were causing the disease. These microorganisms were too small to see, are incredibly infectious and dangerous. Joseph Lister, who lived from 1827 to 1912, would apply Pasteur's germ theory into his practice. Lister had originally become aware of Pasteur's work when he was reading his paper about the transference of disease between microorganisms. Lister went on to apply Pasteur's proposed techniques to eliminate dangerous microorganisms by exposing them to a chemical solution. Through experimenting, Lister concluded that diluted carbolic acid solutions prevented healing wounds from becoming infected and also served as a successful cleaning agent for surgical instruments. A quote from Lister: "When I read Pasteur's article, I said to myself, just as we can destroy lice on the knit-filled head of a child, by applying a poison, so I believe that we can apply to patients' wounds toxic products that will destroy the bacteria. Later on, Lister became aware of Pasteur's work with contagious disease, and the pair would share a long correspondence in which they discussed their experiments, theories, and discoveries. Robert Koch, who lived from 1843 to 1910, was a microbiologist as well who developed various techniques for growing and observing bacteria. By doing this, Koch would develop 4 of what he called postulates that explained the relationship between microorganisms and disease. The postulates read as follows. 1. The microorganism must be found in abundance in all organisms suffering from the disease but should not be found in healthy organisms. 2. The microorganisms must be isolated from a diseased organism and grown in pure culture. 3. The cultured microorganism could cause disease when introduced into a healthy organism. And 4. The microorganism must be re-isolated from the inoculated, diseased experimental host and identified as being identical to the original specific caustic agent. Karl Pflug, who lived from 1847 to 1923, was a colleague of Robert Koch in Germany. Pflug would co-found the Journal of Hygiene and Infectious Disease with Koch. This journal published research material in the form of detailed protocols, charts, and photographs of the progression of bacteriology and hygiene. In 1899, Pflug had been working on tuberculosis research when he developed his droplet theory of infection. This theory went on to improve that microorganisms could be expelled as droplets from the respiratory tract and infect other persons. He would later conduct further experiments and determine that these droplets could be expelled during activities like talking, coughing, blowing, and sneezing. This work would promote the need for the creation of the surgical mask and its implementation in healthcare practices. Now that we have some understanding of just how we as people started to understand how microorganisms cause illness, let's take a look specifically at the history of milk safety for the rest of today's episode. Prior to pasteurization and other safety protocols were implemented, when it came to dairy products, bad milk was a leading cause of death in children. As the US and Europe were rapidly industrializing, there was a spike in infant deaths going up to 150 to 300 deaths for every 1,000 live births per year. Part of this was due to the rapid urbanization, which led to crowded housing, poor environmental sanitation, and for the purposes of this episode, changes in the sourcing and processing of commercial milk. This was also when cow milk formula was introduced, combined with the lack of scientific understanding about the cause for infectious disease, the deaths rose. From 1840 to 1860, there were several factors that led to the decline in milk quality, one of which being the dairy industry expanding during urbanization. This expansion in the dairy industry coincided with a departure from traditional small dairy herds that were housed relatively close to those who would be consuming the milk. These smaller dairy herds would often be housed in open areas in the city with a limit of 70 cows, like in the city of Boston. New dairy herds would have upwards of 2,000 cows confined to cramped urban quarters. These herds would be fed waste from distilleries, often called swill. Other contributors to the decline in milk quality were inadequate refrigeration, the absence of milk processing standards, and fraudulent practices such as mixing additives to allegedly salvage or enhance the increasingly poor quality of the milk. It would not be until the 1870s for cow's milk to be linked to typhoid fever and other infectious conditions. Alongside this decrease in the quality of cow's milk was also a decrease in the amount of mothers who breastfed their children, especially in these rapidly industrialized and urbanized areas. This led to more babies being fed some variant of cow's milk. Around 50 to 70% of mothers were feeding their infants some form of cow milk-based infant formulas due to mothers having to work outside of the home. In one study in New York City, of a total of 1,065 infant deaths from diarrheal diseases, 16.7% of the babies were breastfed exclusively, 22.7% were fed on cow's milk and breast milk combined, and 60.6% were exclusively artificially fed. In cow's milk, there were both human-spread diseases and cow-spread diseases. The two most common human-spread diseases were Salmonella typhi and Salmonella paratyphi. Streptococcal infections were also common, and the third most prevalent being diphtheria. When it comes to cows, they could transfer both bovine and human tuberculosis and brucellosis. The bovine version of tuberculosis is not that common in humans, but it is more invasive to children. who would be the primary ones consuming milk at this time. As the 19th century progressed, the practice of feeding distillery slop to dairy cattle greatly expanded. In 1978, in an address to the Chicago Literary Society, Frederick Sten gave this eye-opening description of what was going on in the urban dairy herds. City milk was almost entirely distillery milk. These distilleries housed up to 2,000 head of cows, such as prevailed in Johnson's grain distilleries of Manhattan. Cow stalls rented for $5 a year, the cost of mash, $2 a month, labor paid in whiskey. The slop it certainly resembled, was conveyed from large elevated tanks into wooden sluices leading to the cow stalls 3 feet wide. The cow consumed 32 gallons of slop and 3 pounds of hay. Ulcers developed in the mouths of the cows. Their tails fell off. Tuberculosis of the glands, lungs, and intestines followed. One Brooklyn distillery indicated that out of 1,811 cows, 230 died in 10 weeks. Milk so obtained was pale blue, often turbid and malodorous. Peculating dairymen concealed their wickedness not so much by diluting the milk with water as by adulterating the swill milk with plaster of Paris, charcoal, starch, sugar, flour, and eggs, making a bad situation worse. No wonder Abraham Jacobi and his colleagues advised mothers to give no milk. So it's safe to say that the milk situation in these rapidly urbanizing, industrializing cities was not good. Going back to Louis Pasteur, who famously worked with pasteurization, who did so from 1860 to 1864, was focused on this process of heating liquid from 140 to 212 degrees to protect the product from spoilage while traveling over long distances via railway. The only problem was he focused on the use of pasteurization for beer and wine, not milk. In 1870, Professor N.J. Ford in Denmark was the first person to adopt the process of pasteurization for milk. In 1882 in Germany, the first commercial pasteurization process was developed. It wouldn't be until 1886 that we would start to use the pasteurization process routinely for milk. Franz von Sulet, a distinguished German chemist, was the first person to design and fabricate equipment for the heat treatment of bottled milk. In 1889, Abraham Jacobi, who we just mentioned, was a German physician working in New York City who also happens to be considered the father of American pediatrics. He became an adamant and vocal supporter for the virtues of pasteurizing milk in the home and endured the use of a specialty apparatus with sealed nursing bottles. In an article from Russell Currier and John Widnes, they state that during the 1880s, following the discoveries of Koch and Pasteur regarding the contribution of microorganisms to disease, contaminated milk was identified as a major vehicle for transmitting childhood illness, particularly summer diarrhea that occurred during the warmer months when bacteria multiplied more rapidly without refrigeration, resulting in an increase in infant deaths. Public health officials became well aware that this was a problem with some, but not all solutions within economic reach. Examples including decrepit tenement housing and overall poor diet. In 1891, while there was still a transition happening with the dairy farm space to allow for pasteurization in bulk, there is still quite a bit of skepticism surrounding the merits of pasteurization. This led to the implementation of ultra-high standards for dairy operations in the meantime. These standards included assuring the purity of raw milk from clean cows, employing illness-free handlers, and using clean and appropriate utensils. Like most change, dairy farms were reluctant to adopt the pasteurization process due to the additional investment in equipment, time, and effort. That said, the public health advantages of pasteurization became increasingly obvious between 1895 and 1910. This awareness then led to well-funded dairy farms in the US, Canada, and the UK to make a competitive advantage by investing in the pasteurization process before the smaller farms could invest. There were some complication with the implementation of this process due to the flash process that was originally utilized with pasteurization. The milk would get too hot, which would result in a cooked taste. The same process could also result in an incomplete pasteurization due to incomplete mixing, which would allow for some bacteria to survive. By 1907, the standard became to batch pasteurize in big vats. And by 1911, Chicago and New York had mandated pasteurization of cow's milk. The combination of higher health standards and the implementation of pasteurizing milk greatly reduced the number of infant deaths. The death rate went from 150 to 300 deaths to 80 to 180 deaths per thousand. Granted, that is still a lot of death, but the death from bad milk or milk-borne pathogens had greatly reduced. There were also some more advances to the commercial production of infant foods. Food scientists had discovered that cow's milk could be modified to be more similar to breast milk and its three major components of carbohydrates, fat, and protein. There is a direct correlation between the increase in both safety standards and the utilization of pasteurizing milk and the decrease in infant deaths. Today, the FDA follows the Grade A Milk Safety Program. Under this program, the FDA is responsible for the following: promoting the adoption, implementation, and enforcement of regulatory standards as provided in the Model Grade A Pasteurized Milk Ordinance, standardizing and certification of state and local regulatory personnel, publishing compliance and enforcement ratings quarterly, training state and local regulatory personnel, assisting laboratory personnel, industry, and academia, check ratings and single-service audits for sanitation compliance of listed shippers, interpreting, evaluating and approving milk laboratories, and written evaluation of state milk control programs. And that is where I'm going to leave us off today. It took hundreds and thousands of years to even get to the point of germ theory and microorganisms, and then many more decades of research and development to implement new ways to make our food safer to consume. I hope you learned something new about why we have these standards when it comes to dairy milk and how these standards came to be. Sources for today's episode include an article from Food Unfolded titled Ancient Food Safety, A Story of Fire and Ice, an article from the Museum of Healthcare titled Discovering Diseases, The Beginnings of Germ Theory and Preventative Precautions by Jessica Lanziner, and an article titled A Brief History of Milk Hygiene and Its Impact on Infant Mortality from 1875 to 1925 and Implications for Today, a review, by Russell W. Currier and John A. Widnes. Thank you for listening to this week's episode. If you liked what you heard, head over to Spotify or Apple Podcasts and leave a review. If you have any questions, comments, or topic ideas, you can email me at itsahistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can also find me over on Instagram and Threads at It's a History Podcast. Thank you again for listening to this week's episode, and I hope to have you in the next one.